Hey guys, we're closing out our David series this Sunday, and this is our last lesson of 2024. We're going to be looking at how David handles conflict and some negative examples from David's life to see what we can learn and glean from that. I'm going to tell two stories, two narratives during our main lesson. One where David overreacts and his reaction to Nabal in 1 Samuel 25, and then another where he ignores conflict with his son Absalom in 2 Samuel 13 and 14. And then I want you guys to actually share one more story that I didn't have time to cover in the lesson. And I want you to kind of walk students through that as best you can in a question, answer, conversational-ish format, so it's not kind of a total extension of the lesson, but I do think it brings out one more important point that I'd like students to cover. So you guys will do that in discussion groups and then cover a few questions as well. You can start and just make sure they don't have anything that they're confused on or have questions about from the main lesson like we usually do, but then move into that third story, which is David's conflict with Joab. And this, if you're not familiar, their particular conflict I'm talking about is in 2 Samuel 3. If you just go and read maybe chapter 2 and chapter 3, you'll kind of get a sense for the sin that Joab commits that affects David and kind of how that conflict arises. But you want to, again, try to lead them through this conversationally, see if they know who Joab is as it relates to David, and then explain the conflict. What happens basically is Abner, who was David and Saul's descendants, are kind of fighting for the throne after Saul dies, and Abner is kind of the leader on Saul's side, commander of the army, and Joab is the leader and commander of David's side, and they have a battle, and Abner ends up killing one of Joab's brothers in that battle. And then a little bit down the line, Abner kind of switches sides and comes on David's side and is helping David establish peace. And so David has kind of made peace with Abner, and they have an alliance together. And Joab is still angry that Abner killed his brother. And so Joab kind of deceives him and takes him aside and murders him. And David is upset about this, and he kind of curses Joab and his household. But that's kind of the end of it. And then we see Joab continue to be the commander of David's army for the rest of his reign, essentially. They are close-ish, and Joab does a lot of good things for David and some not so good things, but they're kind of in close relationship the rest of their life. And you might think, even though the Bible doesn't record it, maybe they had a conversation about this at some point and David forgave him and moved on, until you get to David's deathbed in 1 Kings, I think chapter 3. David is about to hand the reins down to Solomon, and he says, "You know what Joab did to me in killing Abner and one other person later on in David's reign." He says, "Don't let his gray head go down to the grave in peace." Essentially, do whatever you want with Joab, exact revenge on him. And so David kind of harbors anger and bitterness towards towards Joab, and hasn't forgiven him for 40 years, all the way to his deathbed. So you want to ask them why does David do this? So this is another example of kind of ignoring conflict, but with David and Absalom, David kind of cuts Absalom out of his life, and that's kind of how he ignores the conflict. But with David and Joab, the two of them are working together, seeing each other every single day, and yet there's this under the surface conflict and anger and bitterness that David has been holding on to. And so why does David react this way? Why does he not reconcile or move towards trying to forgive Joab or having a conversation with Joab or even punishing him? He could have said, "Because of this, you can't be the commander of my army anymore." So ask them that, make this conversational. I think it's because he was afraid. And sometimes this is kind of the lesson in this story. Sometimes we don't press in to try to resolve conflict because of fear of what we might lose, what it might cost us. And so David's worried, I think, about losing the commander of his army, who has been pretty instrumental in helping bring David to the throne and has a lot of skills that David would like to use. And so because of that, I think he shies away from pressing into this conflict. And so flesh that out for students and then ask them kind of where would we maybe see this today, this avoiding conflict or ignoring conflict out of fear of what it might cost us. Where are some places we might see that? And I think anytime there's an imbalance of power or authority or influence, or for teenagers, popularity, those aren't equal, I think it becomes a lot more difficult to resolve conflict, and we're a lot more prone to avoid it and ignore it. So that happens, in school with a kid who's more popular, holds a lot of sway and a lot of influence. We're much more prone to avoid addressing conflict with a person like that because we might be worried about what that might cost us to press into that. Happens with parents and kids, any kind of authority imbalance or popularity imbalance. So go through that story with them, try to flesh out some takeaways from that, and then the rest of the questions are on our main lesson. The next question is simple and quick, kind of like one we did last week, just asking them which extreme they feel like they lean towards more often in conflict. Do they usually overreact in anger like David did with Nabal, or do they ignore conflict and avoid conflict and avoid resolving it? So seeing their tendencies, that's a good thing to know about yourself, and a good thing even to know about others within the youth group. And so go through that quickly. Number 4, we're going to say David overreacts in the story with Nabal because of his pride. His pride is injured, and his pride is maybe larger than it should be. And because of that, his reaction to that is stronger than it should be. He overreacts in anger. And so if pride can that question is if pride can creep into our lives at any point, even if we're not maybe typically prideful people, how do we guard against that and watch over that in our lives so that we're not overreacting out of pride in the middle of conflict and when people offend and insult and sin against us? And I've got a couple suggestions for you there. It's good to have people around you that are not afraid to be honest with you and say, I think you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Abigail kind of does that for David in a sense in that story that we'll go through in the main lesson. And there are other things you and students can brainstorm together for that question. Number 5 is, why is it important for us to reconcile with someone either that we're not super close to, or we don't plan to have a close relationship with that person moving forward? Why is it still important for us to seek reconciliation and peace and forgiveness with people like that? I've got 2 answers for you there. If that person is a believer, the example I'll kind of give in the main lesson is that I think this happens a lot in the church. People offend us and we think they're not a central part of my life. We're not like super close friends. We go to the same church, but it's easy for us to just kind of ignore each other and not really talk that much anymore. And so I'm going to do that instead of trying to address the conflict and the injury and seek forgiveness with that person. And that's wrong. If they're a believer, especially if they're a member of the same church as you, you're called and commanded to live in peace and unity with your brothers and sisters in Christ. Whether you're best friends or not, you can't just allow an offense to linger and allow yourself or that person to remain bitter and angry towards you indefinitely. So we've got to address conflict within the church. If the person is not a believer, then you have an opportunity, even if you're not close friends with them, to kind of display the gospel. We'll talk about this a little bit in the main lesson, through trying to reconcile with them, seeking forgiveness, offering that to them if you're the offended party, or even seeking reconciliation if you're the one who sinned against them, and showing humility and a willingness to admit when you're wrong and seek restoration. All of those display the gospel to the world around us, and so we ought to take that pathway rather than ignoring conflict altogether. Last question is really important. So as always, feel free to skip around. If we don't have time, you don't have to cover all of these questions, but make sure you get to the last one way or another. This is giving students an opportunity to, and leaders, to sit and think for a few minutes about if they are harboring anger and bitterness towards someone else. There's been a conflict or a sin against them with someone else, and they have just been holding on to that rather than trying to pursue forgiveness and reconciliation and make peace in that relationship. I'll let them think about if that's where they're at, and then kind of based off of the last question, if they have someone like that in their life, they should try to seek reconciliation and enter into those conversations soon. And so this gives a student's time to really make this applicable in their lives. So please make sure you get to that question. Give them 30 seconds, a minute to just sit in silence and think about that in their life and what steps they might need to take. And then you can close with prayer. Thank you guys. We'll see you on Sunday.